Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. The first glimpses of the long-awaited Ukraine peace plan have arrived to a lukewarm reception, and that's only if we're being generous. When US Defense Secretary Mike Hegseth said that Ukraine's 2014 borders are beyond reach, as is NATO membership, there was an outraged choir of voices saying that this is not something that should have happened. And across social media, everyone was saying this is not the plan that we expected, that Ukraine was being thrown under the bus. Others said Europe can still yank it out of the path of destruction, but it's going to be difficult. The big question is this: is America's moral leadership about to collapse? Is Trump lavishing praise upon Russia a part of an elaborate negotiation ritual or a symptom of America's deeper malaise? Have we lost the fight for just peace before it even began? Joining us now is Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO for Emerging Security Challenges. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good afternoon.
So let us begin with the general assessment. Many people have saw it fit to actually panic when they saw these initial signals, but do we have enough information to actually say that this is a bad plan, or do we have to wait for further stages and more details to emerge?
Well, we don't really know what the United States plan is yet, and President Zelensky of Ukraine has said that he has not been given sight of an actual plan. We know that there are prospects of Trump meeting Putin in Saudi Arabia soon and starting talks, and there have been phone calls, but that is not a plan. A plan is something which is very concrete and very detailed: disengagement of forces, demining, return of civilians, an international peacekeeping or deterrent force with lots of implementation annexes. Plans can run to thousands of pages when they're finally agreed. So I don't think we're anywhere close to that type of level of detail yet. We don't quite know what we mean by territorial concessions. All of the territory that Russia is occupying, some of that territory. We don't know if sanctions are going to be lifted before peace talks or during peace talks or after peace talks, and how President Trump can have leverage over Moscow. And of course, the Europeans, who we now understand are going to have to pick up the pieces in terms of providing the troops on the ground to implement the agreement and pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, have also got to be included in those talks, because as the United States used to say itself back in the 18th century, no taxation without representation. So I think we're still at the early stage, and I expect that during the talks in Munich tomorrow and over the weekend at the Munich Security Conference, the Europeans will be putting the point to the Americans that it's all very well Trump talking to Putin, but we need a proper framework for those talks, which have to include Ukraine and have to include the European Union and the major European powers.
Do you think it was a mistake for Pete Hegseth to say Ukraine's NATO membership is not on the table? And also, territories illegally taken away by the Russians, that's beyond reach as well. We're not going to push for these territories to be handed back. Some said that he should have read Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, because he is actually giving up some of the advantages early on in the negotiating process.
Well, the decision to extend membership of NATO to Ukraine was taken by all of NATO allies in Bucharest back in 2008. I was there, present in the room, as a NATO official at the time. So a NATO decision can only be rescinded by NATO. That means, of course, all of the 32 allies, not just by one ally unilaterally. I also think that it's wrong for the allies to give Putin the impression that he can bully NATO and have some kind of veto right over NATO's decision-making by deciding in Moscow who belongs to NATO and who doesn't. I think that would be bad for the alliance's credibility. My own view is that it's not likely that Ukraine would join NATO in the immediate future. There isn't a consensus yet in NATO to do that. That's been pretty clear at the Washington summit last year, other NATO meetings. And it's not just the United States. other European countries have had some doubts about short-term NATO membership for Ukraine. But there's a massive difference between saying you're not ready yet and it's not the right time, and you're never going to be a member, you're outside, and that, if you like, is a final decision. So I think a little bit of ambiguity and pragmatism on that one is better than sort of giving this major concession to Putin in advance.
Speaking of concessions, don't you think this could be a Pandora's box? Russia, even before the war started, indicated that they would also like NATO to retreat from Central and Eastern Europe, essentially to disarm the eastern flank. Do you think that Russia, emboldened by NATO or the United States saying that, okay, membership for Ukraine is no longer an option, they will say, okay, so by the way, we also would like NATO to pull back beyond the area that we, Russia, consider to be our sphere of influence? Do you think that this danger increases as these concessions are actually made?
Yes, I think for me that really would be the nightmare scenario, because coming back to Ukraine's membership of NATO, if you say now that Ukraine should not be a member of NATO, you're giving in to the Putin narrative that there was a sort of fictitious NATO threat to Russia through the process of enlargement, and that therefore Russia was somehow justified or legitimized in invading Ukraine because it was a defensive move. I think that would be terribly, terribly wrong and would simply undermine the basis of the European security order, which is that countries are free to join an alliance if they so wish, and that NATO enlargement has always been about expanding peace and stability in Europe, not increasing threats to anybody. But yes, what alarms me a little bit is that we heard from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, this morning, that apparently Putin wants to throw into the negotiating pot, as you rightly said, this Russian demand back in 2022 that NATO should withdraw from Central and Eastern Europe back to the borders before NATO enlargement began. That would mean US troops out of Poland, out of the Baltic states, German troops, French troops, Canadians, the whole NATO deployment would be removed. And that means that the countries suffering most from the Russian threat, or most vulnerable, would have the least NATO protection. Half of NATO would be secure and the other half would not be secure. That again would be an extremely damaging body blow for the alliance. So it's one thing for President Trump to negotiate on Ukraine, and we'll see what happens there. We'll hope that he's able to at least achieve something that preserves Ukraine as a viable Western-oriented state, and which is more than a temporary ceasefire. But one thing is absolutely fundamental, that he shouldn't give away the entire post-Cold War European security order and weaken NATO in the process. So I very much hope that if Putin wants to put NATO on the table, Trump will rebuff that extremely robustly.
Speaking of sustainable peace, do you think what do you think is going to happen now? Because if not for NATO guarantees, Ukraine said, well, if we don't receive guarantees like that, we would like to have our nukes back. The US said, no, that's not an option. The only option is European troops on the ground as peacekeeping, monitoring forces. Do you think that this is going to happen? And also, will this, if it happens, send a signal that, non-proliferation, not a good option?
Well, certainly we don't want any more nuclear states in the world at the moment, particularly as Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons back in 1990-1991 at the collapse of the Soviet Union. My own view is that we're probably going to have a kind of ceasefire and a return to a frozen conflict. What worries me is that means that if Russia does not withdraw its troops from the territories that it claims to have annexed, you will have a massive Russian military presence on the new borders with Ukraine. And we'll be in a situation similar to 2022 before Russia invaded Ukraine, where it has massive number of troops on the border, which can intimidate Ukraine, threaten to invade, keep Ukraine in a permanent state of anxiety and destabilization, discouraging investment, discouraging political stability, discouraging the return of people to the eastern regions of the country. So the most important thing is to give Ukraine security guarantees, conventional national security guarantees that deter Russia from a future invasion. Now, that means two things. Number one, preserving a very, very large Ukrainian army, and therefore Trump pushing back firmly against Putin's other idea, which is the demilitarization of Ukraine, leaving it with only a tiny army. That has to be rejected. Ukraine will need a very strong Western-trained, Western-equipped army. That process has begun already, of course, during the war with the Western military assistance, powerful Ukrainian defense industries, and some kind of Western force, which is not a UN peacekeeping force, but a deterrent force, which is able to respond quickly to any attempts by Russia to break the ceasefire. So it will be somewhat of a Cold War situation if you think of divided Germany at the time of the Cold War, but that high degree of mobilization, even if it was tense at times, did preserve a free West Germany and a free Western Europe during the Cold War and prevented further Russian advances. So
a massive challenge then. We'll have to wait and see if actually it is possible to negotiate a peace that is sustainable. Shea was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news and features.